Today, we are discussing crisis management and how to conduct an investigation when your organization is front page news. And for many of us, that scenario would make us want to run and hide. We don't want to have anything to do with the negative spotlight. But we are going to take you through some steps today that will help you conduct a proper investigation, help you communicate well with your stakeholders, and end up with a positive result. My name is Dorian Persaud. I am the senior lawyer at Persaud Employment Law. We are a team of lawyers who specialize in conducting workplace investigations and helping you to build healthier workplaces through investigations, training, and proactive advice. Let's look at the case of Kyle Beach and the Chicago Blackhawks as an example of how these scandals are generated and where things go wrong along the way, and what we can learn from the way the Blackhawks mishandled that situation so that you can avoid some of those pitfalls if faced with similar circumstances. So the Blackhawks had a young player on their team by the name of Kyle Beach, and he came forward with serious allegations of a sexual assault. And this news was brought to the attention of the team in the middle of their playoff run. And they had just won a couple rounds in the Stanley Cup playoffs. They were in the Western Conference Final and on their way to securing another Stanley Cup. When this complaint came forward, the team was conflicted. They held a meeting of all of the senior management and the important folks in the organization, and they discussed the complaint and what should be done in response to it. And one of the considerations that they had was, look, we're in the middle of the playoffs right now, and to the extent that this issue becomes known to the public, do we want our players getting asked questions about this investigation or about the incident or the individuals involved? And will this investigation not take the focus away from the ice and onto this HR issue? So the Blackhawks essentially swept it under the rug and said that they would deal with it once the season ended. They eventually did do an investigation, but they weren't able to arrive at any conclusions in terms of whether or not this was a sexual assault or some consensual behavior that had occurred between the parties. They essentially conducted a flawed investigation. They eventually parted ways with the respondent in the case, the assistant coach, but they parted ways with him and wrote him a positive reference letter. So he eventually went on to work at other university hockey programs and allegedly assaulted other individuals while employed at those programs. When it comes to the player or the complainant in this case, though, Kyle Beach, because he wasn't getting anywhere with the Blackhawks, he eventually files a lawsuit. And this internal complaint that could have been resolved peacefully now becomes front page news. And the commissioner of the NHL is quickly on the phone with senior members of the Blackhawks organization. And you have media outlets all across North America trying to figure out, did the Blackhawks really cover up a sexual assault? And if so, why? And who was involved in making those decisions? And as you can imagine, a lot of negative publicity, which eventually led to a third-party investigation being done. And based on the conclusions of that investigation, individuals lost their jobs, including the head coach, Joel Quenneville, the general manager, Stan Bowman, and those individuals were essentially banned from the league and are still trying to find their way back in. So when you're faced with the intense spotlight, what do you do? So when we're talking about a scandal, typically we're talking about an incident that offends propriety, right? Or established moral norms. And usually there's an element of disgrace that's associated with that, whether for the individuals who are directly involved and certainly for the organization itself. And looking at these situations, it's important to keep in mind that they impact a number of different parties in different ways. You've got the individual who allegedly committed this offense, and certainly nothing has been proved when this story broke in the news. And that individual is understandably feeling the heat for these unproven allegations. You've got the individual who, is the, alleged, victim here, the complainant, and they've been harmed and negatively impacted by what they've experienced. You've got the organization, and then the broader community. You've, in this case, you look at the folks that support the Blackhawks or those who are fans of the NHL, and they're wondering, how it is that something like this could be, tolerated by a team in a league that they respect. We can take this down to the local level as well. You think of a principal who's accused of racial discrimination in a local elementary or a high school, and to the extent that that becomes front page news, you've got folks, whether it's parents and others in the community who are wondering, is it really true that the board was aware of these behaviors that were going on and didn't take any steps to address it? So there's a lot that is being discussed, a lot that has not been proven, and you definitely have a PR challenge on your hands. But it's important to look at not just the impact internally on the folks within your organization, but also consider when you're looking at your strategy, the impact that this is having more broadly, and particularly those in the community. These days, when I look back over the last 5 years, we've heard the term cancel culture. And what I'm seeing in a lot of investigations now are third-party advocates who get involved. And for these folks, they're not really interested necessarily in what actually happened and in the investigation and the outcome of the investigation. What they're looking for is for real punishment. They are taking their client's story, they are believing it wholeheartedly without that story ever been tested, and they are going out and challenging employers and challenging school boards and college and university officials and saying, you need to fire the responding parties. You need to take really drastic action in response to not the findings, in response to these allegations that we are bringing forward. They want people fired and dismissed from their jobs. They want these individuals canceled because of these allegations that have been brought up. And there is a lot of pressure when you are a school board official or an administrator dealing with these complaints. You've got the negative spotlight from the allegations themselves. Then you have this advocacy group that is putting additional pressure on you. And it's really easy to cave to that pressure. And what you want to do is make sure that you have an experienced investigator on your side that can stand in the breach, that can be focused on the investigation. And what you want to be focused on is making sound and very well thought out and deliberate decisions as you deal with all of the information and negative attention that's coming your way. So let's go through a few of the essential components to managing these crisis investigations. First off, what you want to do is segment out the responsibilities. So you've got the investigative role and you have the crisis management role. You want that investigative role to be focused on the investigation and not be concerned about all of the other things that are going on, all of the other stakeholders and all of the issues and the possible implications for a finding in that these allegations actually occurred. You want that investigative role to really be focused on just ensuring a process that's going to stand up to scrutiny. So let's examine that a little bit. In crisis management mode, you're looking at putting together a process that is going to stand up to scrutiny. And So they're looking at these issues of procedural fairness and making sure that the investigation is conducted in a timely way, that the individuals, the complainant and the respondent, have a right to be heard, that they are going to be judged impartially, that the investigator is someone who is focused on the evidence and wants to understand what actually occurred here. And they're going to make sure that all parties have all of the information that they need to walk into a meeting and to give a full account and speak to the allegations that have been brought. Confidentiality is so important in every investigation, especially these high-profile ones. And you want to make sure, as an investigator, that you are reminding individuals, both the parties to the investigation, but also management, of the importance of maintaining confidentiality and not discussing and disclosing the allegations, the timing of events, the investigation process itself. You want to maintain all of that information in confidence and avoid any breaches. Now, depending on the type of issue that you're dealing with and the size of the organization, you sometimes have breaches of confidentiality, and this can happen in a couple different ways. You might have a breach of confidentiality as it relates to the parties themselves. You might have a few responding parties who get together and essentially collude and try to coordinate their evidence, right? So that might be something that the responding parties do, or some witnesses do. Or you may have just folks within the organization who are granting interviews to the media and discussing in some level of detail the allegations and when the incidents may have happened and when the complaint was filed, and just giving a little bit of flavor to the investigation and the subject matter itself. So it's one of the challenges here from the when you look at this at that management level is just making sure that everyone's aware of their duty to maintain confidentiality, and making sure that there's only one point of contact when it comes to interacting with the media, and that others are not to make statements, whether on the record or off the record. Where there has been a breach, as the investigator, you're looking at this as, how is this going to impact the investigation? Is this individual's witness, is their evidence compromised by the breach? Have they tainted other witnesses? What impact has this breach had, both on the individual witness and then on the investigation itself? And as an investigator, you're going to have to hold this individual accountable. So quite apart from questioning the individual about the subject matter of the investigation, when it comes to a breach, you're not letting that go by the wayside. You are focused on that, and you are going to be asking this individual questions about how they heard about the subject matter and how that came to their attention, and when. You want to determine the source of the breach, and you want to find out to what extent this witness was involved, and what their culpability level here is. And if you've got evidence that there's been collusion, so you maybe have an email trail, or another witness has disclosed to you, like, look, this is the person that I spoke to, and this person shared this sensitive information with me that they should not have, then you want to use that to hold these individuals accountable. You don't need to tread softly here. You really need to do a robust inquiry to get to the bottom of what's occurred. Yeah. Keep in mind that a breach of confidentiality is an independent act of wrongdoing. And especially where you have a policy that's clear, and this individual has been reminded at the outset of the policy, at the outset of the investigation, as far as the importance of confidentiality, and then they go ahead and engage in that activity anyway, whether out of convenience or malice or whatever the motivation may be, that act in and of itself, the breach of confidentiality, can give rise to discipline and termination. And there are cases where that's been done. So it is something where if that occurs and there's a finding in that regard, that there is grounds here for management to take steps against that individual. As the investigator in this crisis, in the middle of this crisis investigation, you want to make sure that you are keeping the folks who are managing the crisis informed. So there should be regular contact with the management team in terms of the plan for the investigation and the anticipated timelines. Here is when we anticipate meeting with certain parties and certain witnesses, and that way, management has a sense in terms of how things are unfolding and who needs to be made available, and all of those operational decisions that they are responsible for. You want to, as a experienced investigator, keep them informed in terms of how things are evolving. Maybe you started out with 5 allegations, but now that's been expanded to 10. Maybe there was only 1 responding party, but that's been expanded to 3. So you want to make sure that management's aware of these things that are evolving, and especially if there are more serious allegations coming up, or things that would require management to take special steps. So, for example, potential breach of the criminal code that might warrant management to involve the police or regulatory bodies, right? So there's a lot that's going on, and as an investigator, yes, you're responsible for the investigation, but there's also a role here in terms of relaying to management how the evidence is coming in. And you don't have to get into the discussion of the evidence itself, but the implications of that are, we now have more than 1 respondent. Here are the volume of allegations that we now have, and there's a potential criminal code issue here that may need to be pursued. And then, as we talked about confidentiality, if there's a confidentiality breach, that is something that you want to report to management so that they can take the appropriate steps. One of the biggest mistakes that the Chicago Blackhawks made after receiving the complaint from Kyle Beach was they didn't look at the complaint itself and just focus on the allegations and what needed to be done, right? They took a holistic approach to the issue. And that was their first mistake, because when you take that holistic approach now, as far as, hey, is this investigation a good idea? And what about the timing of this investigation? And how is this going to impact the positive PR that we've got going here in the Stanley Cup playoffs? And how is this going to impact the mojo of our players, right? Like, once you bring in all of these other considerations, you are going down the wrong path as far as, following interests that could, and in this case, very well did, lead to significant legal liability. So anyone who has an interest in the public image of the organization, or issues of reputational damage, they cannot be involved in that investigation role that I just talked about. So you want to have these roles clearly delineated. You have 1 person in charge, or a team in charge of the investigation, and you've got a separate team that's handling the crisis management role. And as we move now to look at that, what that crisis management role looks like, well, they still have that obligation to maintain confidentiality, right? So again, you want to make sure that all those individuals are aware that those who don't need to know about the specifics of the allegations or who's involved are not informed of those details. And you are keeping this information within a very small circle to do the work that you need to do. You want to make sure that in that crisis management role, that that there is communication with members of the executive team, right? So there's any number of individuals who are not connected with the investigation or managing the crisis directly who still need to be made aware of whether or not this how this process is unfolding and if things are moving and if there's been a delay and what's the reason for the delay. So in broad strokes, you want to make sure that you've got a communications plan that allows you to communicate necessary details in a way that allows the organization to continue to function. Some of the other issues that the crisis management team will be dealing with is retaining legal counsel if that hasn't been done already. That's going to be a key step. Looking at issues such as litigation privilege. So sometimes you get a complaint, there hasn't been litigation that's initiated, you've just received the complaint, but just upon receiving it, you're aware that, look, if this complaint is true, it's very likely that one or more individuals is going to lose their job, and very likely, that could lead to litigation. So to what extent then are we taking steps to assert litigation privilege over some of this work product? And those are discussions that you are going to have with a lawyer to determine, what your strategy is going forward. There's the obligation to preserve evidence along the way, and this is both evidence that is helpful and harmful to you. So, yeah, I think some of us might remember the images that came that were circulated with Conrad Black back when he was charged with fraud, and he was going through his trial, and there's him leaving the offices of his company with bankers boxes and people helping him kind of carry bankers boxes and load them into his vehicle. So that's where you don't want to be, right? Is caught or even if you're not caught on camera, you certainly don't want to complicate the situation further by tampering with or destroying evidence because that eventually will come out. Communication is extremely important in these circumstances, and from the time that the story breaks and this news is made known, you've got individuals within your organization who have questions, right? They may be familiar with the folks involved, or even if they aren't, they're wondering, hey, did this thing really happen? And to what extent was management aware of this misconduct? And did management, tolerate this misconduct? And, so how did this scandal evolve, so to speak? So you have to, really focus on that communication strategy for dealing with your workforce and making sure that they are given, some information in terms of addressing you're not going to answer all the questions that they have, but you can have a communication plan that acknowledges what's going on and provides them with some comfort as the investigation process unfolds. And that, we've seen that done in the form of town hall meetings. There may be information that's posted to an intranet site. There's any number of solutions based on the size of the organization and what makes sense in a given circumstance. You also have to consider your stakeholder communications, and you have a number of stakeholders when it comes to these individuals. You've got we talked about your workforce itself, and there may be funding partners involved as well, right? That you need to make known. So you get funding from the government. You may have an obligation, whether that's a contractual obligation or simply as a matter of good faith, to let the funder know, hey, look, this is what's happened, and here's what we're doing in response. And failure to take the right steps, again, whether there's a contractual obligation or not. Failure to take the right steps, may have implications going forward in terms of your continued funding. You've got parents or folks in the community who are interested. There may be a regulatory body that needs to be made aware. So you want to take a look at your stakeholders in a very broad sense and make sure that you're communicating with them appropriately as the matter unfolds. we've been involved in investigations where there may be a fiduciary duty or a special duty that you have to the individuals involved. So if you have a counselor, for example, who's accused of being involved in an inappropriate relationship with a minor or with someone who may not have capacity, right? Who has mental health issues or some other disability, and they don't have capacity to give consent. There may be an obligation there to inform that a fiduciary duty to inform that person's family or their power of attorney of what has just occurred. And so there may be an obligation to inform a regulatory body, depending if you're dealing with someone in a regulated profession who has been who's involved in a serious incident or a crime. So there are these special considerations that you want to be mindful of, depending on the circumstances. In those communications, you want to be neutral, and because we're just at the outset of the process here, make it clear that here are the allegations that have come up, that we are, as an organization, we're not dismissing them. We are taking them very seriously. We are following our process, or we've retained an external investigator. We are taking steps to pursue this and get to the bottom of this, but we are satisfying our obligations to you as far as making that government body or regulatory body aware of what is taking place. And then you want to consider, how you're going to make that communication. Is that going to be a letter from the board of directors? Is it a more personal phone call that you make? These are just other considerations once you identify the stakeholders that you need to communicate with and what that communication looks like. At the end of the investigation, there is going to be a finding, and that may be something that needs to be communicated to, that certainly has to be communicated to the parties, but it's something that may need to be communicated to the other stakeholders, and so it really just depends on the context here. Again, there's a range of considerations here. We obviously you're balancing the need to inform stakeholders as against the privacy rights of the individuals involved. But I know that in certain contexts, it's appropriate to make the findings of the investigation public. So we saw this with in the Gian Ghomeshi case, where he was accused of sexual assault and harassment by several complainants who had come forward and who had indicated that this behavior had occurred over a period of several years. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, being a high-profile employer and this being a high-profile case, felt obligated to make that report available for public consumption. I know in other contexts, such as in a church or a ministry context, where there's misconduct on the part of someone on the leadership team, that's an example where it's sometimes necessary to let the community know, like, here's what occurred, here's what our findings are, and that's necessary in order for that community to deal with the issue and to heal and to move forward. So there's going to be a different answer here, again, based on the context that you find yourself, but it is something that you do want to be mindful of at the conclusion of the process. And then finally, once you've concluded the investigation and taken those steps, you want to look internally and do a debrief and determine, look, are there gaps in our policies and procedures? How did we get here? And what can we do to avoid a similar situation happening again? When we look at the situation with the Chicago Blackhawks, there were all the right policies in place, and there were guidelines there that the club could have followed to deal with the complaint that had been brought before them. But instead, they looked at other considerations and placed the focus of the team as being paramount, and placed this issue on the back burner. And it not only caused harm for Kyle Beach and led to a significant settlement with that individual, But you look at the harm that was caused when they, because they didn't do a proper internal investigation, and it's unclear, what their conclusions are, or what their findings were after dealing with this matter internally. But this individual, the assistant coach who engaged in the sexual assault, he went on to assault other young boys at other programs, and all of that harm could have been avoided had the club uh, done the right thing, and acted responsibly when they received the initial complaint. So you want to look at, it's fine to have the right policies, but do you have a culture of enforcing your policies? Are there issues or individuals who stand in the way of the right steps being taken? And so you want to really look at the internal operations, and figure out what went wrong, why did it go wrong, and how can we learn from this going forward. I'm happy to take your questions now, and I would ask you to direct them to me using the Q&A function. There's a question here that's come forward. When an allegation is made by the complainant, are you saying that the respondent is not offered a copy of the allegation to defend themselves in an alleged wrongdoing or harassment? Sorry for the confusion, Peter. I would never advocate for the respondent not being given a copy of the allegations. So the proper step here is, let me back up. In every investigation, the respondent, our position is that the respondent should always be given a copy of the allegations. Responding party should always have enough time to review the allegations and come to a meeting with the investigator prepared to put their best foot forward and answer all of these allegations. So you want to make sure they have enough time to go through their emails and their notes and prepare to attend that meeting with you. So at our firm, it's our practice that a responding party has at least 3 days to prepare before an investigation interview, if not more, again, depending on the nature of the allegations and the volume of the allegations. But we typically want to provide them with 3 days to a week, so that they have the allegations in hand well in advance of their meeting with us. The process for getting the allegations into the individual's hands is something that's important to consider. So when you as an organization receive the complaint, you don't necessarily want to take that raw complaint and hand that over to the responding party. And the reason for that is because oftentimes what you have in the written complaint is incomplete or may not be phrased in an accurate way. So the best practice is to, once you receive the written complaint, the investigator would meet with the complainant and get their story, and then draft what's called particulars of complaint. So this is a list of all of the allegations that the complainant has made. Here are all the things that they are complaining of. And that list of allegations, after it's approved by the complainant, that's the list that gets provided to the responding party. And it's based on that that they have the focus to prepare and attend an investigation interview. Another question that's been asked here is, how would you handle a conflict with management on how to handle this kind of a situation? For example, as an HR manager, you may not have the influence to spur the actions that you described here. And that's a fantastic question. You, as the HR professional, you know what the right thing to do is, and you advocate for that process to be followed. But you're just one voice, and there are other folks on the management team, and maybe even more senior than you on the team, who want to take a different road, who want to handle this thing in a different way. And you can see the writing on the wall. You know that this is not a good idea, and this is likely not going to end well. So you want to document the advice that you are giving to management. At the end of the day, you're not the one that's charged with making the final decision here. But what you want to do is make it very clear that here's the process that should be followed, here's what your recommendations are, and uh, and then if management decides to ignore that advice or do something differently, then that's their decision to make. But you have done your role as an HR professional to, again, provide them with guidance on how they should be responding to this issue, and protecting yourself, right? Because depending on how the situation unfolds, and uh, and then and any subsequent investigation that might be initiated. When we see the Chicago Blackhawks case, that there was the internal investigation, we have the lawsuit. The NHL then pressures the Blackhawks, and they have an external investigator that comes in and looks at all these issues again. And you have very high-ranking individuals who lose their jobs, and these folks really had no explanation for their decisions other than they did what was convenient in the moment, right? So you had, it's rare that you have a senior head coach with the pedigree that Joel Quenneville has to be dismissed. Same thing for the general manager, who was an experienced individual and wasn't as well regarded for his hockey mind, being dismissed. And so the same thing, in any other public or private organization, same thing can happen, and you want to make sure that when the spotlight shines on HR, and what did HR do when they received the complaint. You want to have some paper trail that you can say, look, here's what we did, and here's how we supported the complainant, and here's the process that we tried to put in place, and others didn't follow our advice. That's the best that you can do in that situation. Any other questions about how to conduct an investigation when you're in the spotlight? Another question here is that occupational health and safety legislation suggests there is a requirement to investigate any allegation of harassment. What is your take on this? So the Occupational Health and Safety Act requires that you take steps to do a fact finding and look into all allegations and complaints that come before you. And the reason for looking into them is because you can have legitimate complaints and concerns that are brought forward, but they're dismissed, right? And they're not taken seriously, maybe because of who's brought them forward, right? You have someone who's a frequent flyer. This person complains about everything, and it's easy to just dismiss whatever this person's bringing forward, or it may be dismissed for based on who the responding parties are or what the alleged wrongdoing is. In any event, if employers don't look into these complaints that are brought forward, then the individual, the employees aren't really given the protection of their human rights aren't protected, right? That you could be discriminated against, you bring a complaint forward, no one takes it seriously, that discrimination just continues, right? Your human rights continue to be violated, or you continue to be harassed or sexually harassed. So when it comes to responding to the complaint, it's not that you have to rush out and get a third-party investigator for every complaint that comes forward, right? Like that would be a waste of time and resources. You just have what the legislation is trying to do is to say you can't ignore it. So what you want to do in this case is look into it. You receive the complaint. If you want to have a vetting process where, if this complaint is true, does it violate any of our policies, right? If what this person is complaining of happened, does this violate our harassment policy or the Health and Safety Act? Does this constitute discrimination? And if the answer to that question is no, if what this person is complaining about does not violate any of the policies and any workplace policies or the Health and Safety Act, then there's no reason to then escalate it and do any sort of a formal investigation. There may be other steps that you take, right? So there may be a legitimate concern, and you would meet with the individual and resolve that in an informal way. or through some other mechanism, but there doesn't need to be a formal investigation. So you would only launch a formal investigation where uh, is what's being complained of. If it's true, does it violate the Health and Safety Act or any of our applicable policies? Uh, another consideration is, if this thing is true, does it potentially lead to legal liability on our part? Does it lead to reputational harm? And and so those are some of the main considerations that you would look at in terms of when you want to trigger a formal investigation, whether that's internal or using an external investigator. I hope that answers your question. Anyone else with any questions on this topic of how to conduct an investigation when you are in the spotlight? Okay, well, I'm not seeing any more questions come through, so I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. It's always a pleasure to share this information with you. As you know, we'll have another webinar in 2 weeks' time, and we trust that you will join us for that event in terms of managing the external investigator and how to make sure you can keep the external investigator on track and on budget. Please do connect with me on LinkedIn. You can scan the QR code, and I'm always on LinkedIn. You can find me there, pose any questions that you might have, and we'll be sending you information about future events. So thanks very much. All the best, and look forward to seeing you soon.